Do not ask if there is a self, or do I not exist. Ask if you are causing yourself suffering by clinging to a specific notion of who you are or how you want others to perceive you. Hi, it's Margaret Meloni, and welcome to Season 3 of the Death Dhamma Podcast. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so appreciative that you are part of my community. And yet, I seek not to be attached to the idea of the podcast or even to the idea of our community. And that's our topic this season: attachment, clinging, and aversion. What happens when we really want something? What happens when we really don't want something? And what does it do to our suffering and dissatisfaction? Let's dive in and find out a little bit more with today's episode. Remember, the Buddha taught suffering and the cessation of suffering. You know this. All you have to do is recall the Four Noble Truths for a refresher on the purpose of his teachings. And all most of us need to do is to look at our own lives for our own personal lessons on how we bring about our own suffering. The question that the Buddha posed to Venerable Anuruddha was, and is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? The answer to the question, and is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful, is stressful. You can find lots of discussions in terms of self versus no self, and what the Buddha really taught and what the Buddha really meant. And I am staying away from going into an in-depth discussion of these various interpretations. To share context, I speak to you as a Theravada Buddhist, and I draw on the teachings from the Pali Canon. And I come from a place of working with teachings of these things are not self. As in the answer to this question, and is it proper to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? The answer being no. It is not proper to view that which is inconstant, stressful, and subject to change as self. Now, in terms of what are these inconstant things that are being discussed and found to be stressful and subject to change? Form, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness. To give you an idea of the teachings around how each of the above are not self, I'd like to share with you this one passage from the Samyutta Nikaya 22.59 called Panchavajja Sutta, the Five Brethren, but also called Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Discourse on the Not-Self Characteristic. Form, monks, is not self. If form were the self, this form would not lend itself to dis-ease. It would be possible to say, with regard to form, let this form be thus, let this form not be thus. But precisely because form is not self, form lends itself to dis-ease. And it is not possible to say with regard to form, let this form be thus, let this form not be thus. And in that sutta, a similar type of phrasing and teaching is used around each of the other feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness. In other words, if these things were stable, if they weren't, inconstant, then we would be able to have maybe some kind of a control over them, like let this form be thus, let this form not be thus, and it wouldn't be subject to falling apart, changing, etc. Right? So now let's integrate this with a teaching that has been very popular on the Death Dhamma Podcast. I say it, I write it frequently. You could probably sing along with me. The rising and falling, right? What arises ceases. Given inconstancy or impermanence, how can any of us be one thing, an unchanging self? We are not. But we might try. we create these images, these personas. And from a conventional or perhaps functional perspective, they serve us. For example, at home, you might be a partner or a parent or both. Maybe you're a dog owner. You go to a family reunion and you are a daughter or a cousin. You go to work and you are the boss. And in some ways, all of these roles blend together to create this self. And you use this self and these roles to navigate the various scenarios that make up your life. You go to work as the boss and you respond in boss mode. You might have a parental style of leadership. If so, then, if you have children, then there could be some crossover, right? And perhaps you share pictures of your dog. But in this work setting, you are the boss and you have expectations of yourself, an image of yourself, and you have a certain way you wish to be perceived. This serves you until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it's very possible it's because you are unhappy with someone's perception of you, or something in your carefully constructed self changes. Maybe one day you are no longer the boss. Now what? For most of us, now suffering. We must adjust how we act or communicate with our coworkers, maybe even look for a new job. And the more importance we placed on being the boss as part of ourself, well, the harder it's going to be. It's not bad to have been in charge. It's not wrong to play a certain role. It's just really difficult when we assume that role to be unchanging, when it becomes embedded into our psyche. For some of us, there are cultural challenges too. For example, it's not uncommon when people are being introduced to ask, "What do you do for a living?" or something similar. An attachment to work and our roles at work. That's something that very much exists in the culture that I'm in. In other cultures, the questions might be around who your family is and where they are from, because there are entire rules of social interaction built around trying to figure out someone's social status so that you know how to treat them. It can be rather exhausting. And we're not going to solve these cultural challenges today during this podcast. That's not why we're here. Remember, the question is not, is there a self, or do I not exist? The question is, are you causing yourself suffering by clinging to a specific notion of who you are or how you want others to perceive you? That's the question. And if the answer is no, I'm not causing myself suffering by clinging to a notion of who I am or how I want others to perceive me, that is great. If the answer is yes, then you're like most of us, I suspect. And also, ask yourself more questions. Questions like, how do I describe myself to others? And if I were forced to remove part of that description, which part would be the hardest for me to let go of? Let's stick with the example of being the boss. Perhaps you describe yourself as a hard-working corporate executive who loves being a parent to 2 challenging toddlers with a loving and understanding partner and a rambunctious dog. How difficult would it be for you to remove the part about being a corporate executive? And if you had to get rid of that part about being a parent, could you do it? What about that loving and understanding partner? Okay, clearly not the dog. You're not going to let go of the part about the rambunctious dog. Okay, I kid, but in many cultures, our pets are our families. Each of these descriptions represent a bit of selfing. Some of it you might just throw in for cultural conventions, right? To give other people context of who you are. Some of it might be very important to you. I had a colleague once who, the minute he walked into a conference room, if he didn't know who was in the room, it was very important to him that everyone know his title. I never saw him socially, so I don't know if this was important to him, outside of the office as it was important to him in the office. It seemed like a very important part of how he saw himself and how he wanted others to see him. Okay, but back to you. When you can find the part of your self-description that's the most difficult to let go, you are on your way to finding how your sense of self can lead you to suffering. And now you have something to work on. I would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your suggestions, your own stories about attachment. So follow this link, I'm going to read it to you in a minute here, to leave me a 90-second message with your ideas and suggestions. You can go to https://www.speakpipe.com/death_Dhamma_podcast. I suppose you could also just use your favorite search engine to say SpeakPipe Death Dhamma Podcast. And there you can record an audio message for me. And be sure to come over to margaretmeloni.com. That's MargaretMeloni.com and join the community. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma Podcast with your host, Margaret Meloni. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmeloni.com, margaretmeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.